Okay, today I have the great opportunity to talk to somebody new. His name's Thor Magnusson. I was actually turned on by a couple of you listeners out there ringing me up and saying, hey, here's a guy that we need to take a look at. And when I dug into it, I was like, oh my God, right down the center of the plate on this one. He's just recently released a book. He has done some amazing performances and composition work, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about that. So with no further ado, let's talk to Thor. Hey, Thor, how's it going?
Hi, Darwin. Fine, yeah. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this interview. I'm very excited to hear more about your work because it seems pretty damn fascinating. So why don't we start off by having you talk about all the things that you do?
Yeah, so I guess I'm just interested in music and music making. And as part of that, I'm kind of look into the technologies of music making. And when you start to dig into the tools and instruments and technologies that we use, you start to see a lineage of kind of designs and ideologies that have followed us throughout the centuries. Defining the way that we shape our music and how we organize our musical practices. So today, of course, we're working with digital media. Code is our notational script in many ways, or notation language. So I've been interested in writing my own music software. In the past 10 years, I've been creating a few live coding environments. So that's been kind of my practice-based research. But I'm also kind of an academic, and I'm interested in kind of reflecting critically upon our practices. So that has resulted in a book publication. I had a book coming out with Bloomsbury earlier this year called Sonic Writing. And that's a book where I look into the technologies of music making. Actually, the subtitle is called Technologies of Material, Symbolic, and Signal Inscriptions. And in the book, I'm looking into instruments and notation and phonographic technologies.
Right. I found that that kind of split a really interesting way of viewing it. So the material, what in the book you describe as material inscriptions is like the instruments that are made. Symbolic inscriptions are the written implementation of music or notations, and the signal inscription is the recording. And I guess in my mind, I had never really split up the world of music and composition, and especially the history of composition in quite that way. But I noticed in your book, in the sample chapter I read, that in the introduction you talk about the concept of musical archaeology. And I can see where this kind of organization actually really plays into that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I guess I'm quite inspired by a philosopher called Bernard Stiegler, who has this theory of grammatology, that with language and with our technologies, we're externalizing our thoughts into objects or into symbols, into words, into concepts. And by creating external kind of objects or words, we are kind of representing the world, and we're putting things into order, and we're writing our kind of environment. So everything is kind of a signifying object or a concept. And that ranges from, a bone flute to a live coding library or a DSP code or something. It's all kind of external representation of certain ideas or ideologies.
Right. Now, one of the things that is kind of exciting for me about your work is that it's not just a theoretical pursuit. You actually take this out in the field and do it yourself. Again, one of the people that introduced me to you and to your work also pointed to an Ars Electronica performance where you were actually on stage with a couple of other performers. You were doing a live coding thing, but the live coding process also developed like a real-time visual scoring that also was representative of what was going on. And I found that really interesting because tying it back to some of the other stuff that you've done, it seems like you are embracing all of these different parts of music composition and music development into your own practice.
Yeah, I think in many ways music is applied philosophy. The way, the stage is a laboratory, and our musical instruments are our scientific instruments. We're exploring the world with our instruments, just like scientists do. And for me, creating an instrument, creating a live coding language is a way to explore certain concepts. And the software that you're talking about, the one I was using in that Ars Electronica performance, is called Theranoscope. And it's basically a graphical live coding system where on the left you see a representation of what I'm creating in code on the right side of the window. And I think the audience, it's a drone type of live coding system. I had another live coding language called Ixilang, which was very much about beats and kind of techno music. But I was more interested in creating kind of longer performances, not beat based. So I decided to come up with a system that was circular rather than linear, and long durational notes that would kind of move around in space as well. So the system is really, it can be stereo, it can be 8-channel, 4-channel, 7.1, 5.1, but it's basically consisting of small or notes that move over the speakers, or representation of the speakers. Okay. So it's almost like the notes move across the speaker, and the speaker is the timeline, so to say, in a circular kind of system. Right. And then it's kind of inspired by tuning systems such as different ethnomusicological tunings, or Lamont Young's kind of idea of tuning, or so I have various tuning systems as part of the system. But what you see basically is the harmonics of a fundamental frequency, and then in my performance I put events onto the different harmonics according to some tuning, and that results in a very droney performance, which I believe people are quite happy to improvise on top of. So right. I play a lot with other musicians. So if I'm invited to perform somewhere, I typically ask if there is any good local improviser that might want to join me. And I've been very fortunate to play with some amazing people around the world who improvise on top of this kind of constant drone.
So do they use the graphic as something that they improvise with, or are they just responding to the sound and you're using the graphic as a display of what your work is?
Yeah, some people, they are interested in the graphics and they see it as a score, and sometimes they might be anticipating an event that is coming and they wait for it to happen and then they start to play with that. Others, they just close their eyes and they couldn't care less about the graphics. But I had one person performing with me, and he wanted to face the audience. You know how live coding performances, we normally project on the wall behind us on the screen. Yeah. He wanted to face the audience, so he put up a mirror in front of him on stage, so he could see see what was happening behind him.
Right. That sounds really amazing.
Good technology, the mirror,
Yeah, really, exactly. Well, talking about being able to use Baroque tools to make modern music, that's a pretty good one. So, Thor, one of the things I like doing is talking to people about the background and how they got to be the artists and creators that they are. And I'm kind of curious about your path, because you have this very studied idea of what, you know, music and music making and sound development looks like to you. But you've also dropped a few nuggets about how, like, you had a piece of software that was kind of techno-y based, right? And that you know, you're actually doing some software development, but also, you know, talking a little bit, as you do in your book, about some of your studies of what other people have done in sort of an archaeological sort of bent or a musicological kind of view. I am curious to know what got you involved in musicianship. What drew you towards technology in music? I mean, because in many ways you like almost personify the name of my podcast. My podcast is called Art Plus Music Plus Technology, and that seems to be what you've built your whole life around, right? So I'm curious where you're coming from and how you got to this place.
Yeah, it's a big question, obviously, because it depends on how far you want to dig down. But yeah, so I studied music from a young age, played music all the time. I was in bands and played classical music as well. And I studied then philosophy at university. And I got interested in the philosophy of mind. And through that, I got interested in AI. And I figured that I needed to program computers in order to understand AI properly. So I started messing about programming. And it struck me immediately that programming languages are actually very good musical languages. It's about creating patterns, repetitions, structuring things, putting things into arrays, having, you know, control statements, if statements, things like that. So the coding language for me became a very interesting kind of musical notation language. And at the same time, I was discovering Super Collider. So I realized that it's not just about notes and harmonies and so on, but signal processing as well.
Sure.
And around that time, I then began becoming interested in, so at the time I was living in London, I was playing with some friends. We were using, you know, commercial software, but we found that it was really bad for live performance. It was all kind of studio simulations software. I didn't have Max MSP at the time, but we began to be interested in creating smaller kind of instruments, like graphical user instruments that we could use in our performances. So small instruments that would do certain thing really well and only that thing, sort of really constrained system.
Right.
So we created quite a few of those and gave it to friends as well. They wanted to use it, you know, people, friends that were in the improv scene in London. And we then put it online, and within a week we got very surprised that we saw that people were downloading this software from all over the world. So we kind of kept working on this software. It's called ICSI software. I was working with a friend called Enrique Hurtado. Yeah, and that kind of software then got bigger and bigger, and I started implementing live coding capacity in this software, so you could kind of live code under the hood, so to say, certain things. And at the time, the whole live coding scene was blooming here in the UK, and I think I presented this in one of the first live coding festivals that Alex McLean organized in Sheffield.
Right. Yeah.
In 2007, I think it was. But before that, I had been performing quite a lot with this software in clubs and venues all over Europe, basically. So you could say that, you know, it's kind of a triangle that I'm interested in. I'm interested in in technology, software, philosophy, and music. And to me, sometimes they're all the same thing, really. I do, as I said before, I do think music is applied philosophy, and through music we can do so much thinking and so much kind of investigation into the world.
I really like that as a concept, music as applied philosophy, because it points to the idea that it's more than just, or it requires more than just a knowledge of the techniques, right? In order to make compelling music, it has to be more than a good quality rendition of notes, right? There's the opportunity and almost a requirement for emotion, personality, and like engagement at a deeper level, on an almost philosophical level, in order to make anything that's even worth listening to.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. And it's actually quite enjoyable these days, when our creative AI systems have become so good at creating, music of some sort, that we're able to ask our students, how are you going to make your music better than a robot,
a Spotify robot, right?
Yeah, and what is it really that makes music unique? Because the machine learning systems, they're only kind of boiling everything down to the common denominator, so to say. But what is it? What is the human creativity, as you mentioned? The unique personal kind of take on what music is. How do we do that? And it's interesting today to talk about musical creativity with all this AI around, and then talk about the creative process in that context, I think.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to have that AI thing. When you were doing your study on AI, what kind of time frame was that? Was that recent, or was that a decade or two ago?
Yeah, I was kind of starting in the 90s, late 90s. Okay. I came to Sussex University in 2004 to do a PhD in computer science and AI.
Okay.
I had music software as part of my project. So I was really just writing music software and thinking about, and it turned quite a lot into kind of philosophy of technology project. Right. I got really interested in how we think differently with different types of software.
Well, that's an interesting time frame, though, because there was the time in the 70s and 80s where AI was very highly regarded, and then it's like people saw chess work and they saw a couple of things that was like, yeah, okay. And it sort of kind of fell out of favor for a while, and it wasn't until all of a sudden data analysis and large bodies of data became available that all of a sudden people were like, oh, that AI stuff, that might be useful now. It seems like you kind of came in at the beginning, or even just before the resurgence of interest in AI. Was it your philosophy background that really got you intrigued in it, or was there something else that drew you towards AI?
Yeah, it was philosophy. It was kind of philosophy of mind, and through that cognitive science. And then, in cognitive science, we often use AI as a kind of mirror of the human mind. So right, we try to understand ourselves with the reference of AI. And at the time, we call it symbolic AI, kind of AI that is not using neural networks, but it's all programmed. But I guess since the 2000s, there has been a resurgence in artificial neural networks, and particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, there has been, an explosion with the deep learning networks. Right. So we have now all these kind of Google Magenta and Google Brains projects that are doing actually experimental music work, very important, interesting research. Many would argue that the music doesn't sound very good, it's not very interesting music at the moment. But that's that's hang in there, I say, and watch this space, because this is proper research and this is really interesting, and I think something interesting will come out of this in the future.
I'm interested to hear you say that, because I was wondering, especially with a philosophical background, and one where you were approaching AI as sort of like this mirroring system. I was wondering how skeptical you would be about the value proposition of that kind of stuff, because I mean, in a way, it would be very easy for the typical musician to just sort of say, well, it can only learn from crap that's already been done, so that's the only way that we're going to, it's only going to regurgitate the stuff that it's already heard. Mm-hmm. I think that's a pretty reductive view of it, but I'm really interested to hear more about your feelings about AI-driven music tools.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people would fit into that description that you just gave. I think maybe AI, the question is, can it be transformative? Can it really bring something unique, something new into the picture? And I guess maybe not yet, I think, and that's also maybe the question: what are we really doing with AI? There's a tendency to think that we're gonna replace the human composer and performer with some AI system, but I think most of the people who are working with AI in music, they are more thinking about this as a kind of augmentation system, where you maybe augment your instrument, or you have some kind of DAW software and you can kind of ask the AI to lay out some drum tracks for you because you can't be bothered. You just want to do something very quickly.
Well, yeah, having played around with some of the Magenta team's Ableton Live devices, I found it really interesting, because a lot of them are oriented towards give us a starting point and then we'll give you variations, which seems like a very kind of like human-centered approach to using AI. Rather than saying, give me a blank track and I'll do something incredible, it instead tries to say, give me an example of what you're doing and let me give you some things to check out. And I think that seems like, it still puts the composer, designer, whatever you want to call that person. I don't know if you're just kind of like editing what's been produced. I'm not sure you can actually call yourself a composer, but I think maybe still. Nevertheless, I think it's valuable or interesting to say, to look at AI as being a thing that can propose options for you to consider. That seems like a very human-centered way of doing it.
Yeah, isn't the origin of technology just because we're lazy, so we couldn't be bothered digging a hole with our hands, so we came up with a spade,
with a shovel, right?
So, we might be, asking the technology to do things for us that we can't be bothered doing, and I can see that AI, as you describe, kind of help us. They become our compositional tools or helpers, kind of servants. But I think you hit the nail on the head here. This is what I think most musicians and composers, designers working in AI and music are thinking. This is going to be some kind of augmentation tool. But the other thing, to have an AI composing music and on its own, that's almost like a kind of a philosophical experiment. You're kind of creating the Frankenstein, or it's a challenge, like creating a chess computer that could win the grandmaster of chess.
Right.
Yeah, and the story is often told that when the Deep Blue won Kasparov in chess, AI scientists started to think, what can we do next? Our computer won Kasparov, but it's still really stupid, and AI is very primitive. Where can we kind of imitate the human intelligence next, and they then started to focus on creativity as the kind of human trait that they aimed to conquer. And that's still kind of a holy grail, you could say, in some AI circles, is to kind of figure out how to be creative. But we musicians, I don't think we want AI to do everything for us. We want to use it as a tool, as a kind of a technology, like an instrument or whatever. But we're not asking the AI to replace ourselves, you know.
Well, I think in some cases people are looking for some pretty significant help, though. If you think of like the isotope mixing tools, right, that basically listen to your track and kind of just do a improvement layer on it as if you had a better engineer sitting in the room with you. I mean, that's a little further down the path of just doing stuff for us. But it seems like it's still pretty hard to find machine-driven functions that exceed what humans are able to do, at least in my experience.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. A lot of the AI people, they talk about this as a good system, for example, for YouTubers who cannot pay the copyright of the music that they use in their video. So they can then generate a copyright-free track for their YouTube video. And then, yeah, you might then ask, wouldn't they want to have a little bit more input into the music? So the question is, how can we open up the music?
Support that a little bit,
yeah. Yeah.
I agree. So I'm curious then, in making your own tool, I mean, in our show notes, there will be a link to a video where you can see the Theranoscope in action. In developing your tool, first of all, you have this graphic orientation, which again is kind of a symbolic inscription, as you call it, way of thinking about the music that's being made. But also, it is a live coding language. How much, like, quote, intelligence do you have in that software so that the commands you type in sort of like expand into larger functions?
Yeah, not so much really. This is basically just to create different waveforms and so on. But I also have a few musical concepts in there, like tuning systems and scales, chords, and that kind of stuff. But then apart from that, I just enjoy kind of live coding everything from scratch. So I create for loops. I create.
Okay, so you don't want it doing too much for you, is what you're saying?
No, not really. I'm quite minimalist with this software, this particular software. I like to just enjoy the simple waveform and then add on to it and be kind of in a state of reflection throughout the performance. You can see, the video you're going to link to is 30 minutes long. Yeah. I actually performed it at, I think it was 48 hours of Top Lap performances when the live coding organization Top Lap was 15 years old earlier this year. Wow. So I had 30 minutes to perform it, and this is what I did. So it's a very kind of slowly evolving performance.
So what is it about live coding that sucked you in? I mean, it seems like a lot of the people I know that are into live coding are kind of control freaks, right? They like literally building stuff up from the ground up every time they perform. And it kind of sounds like your engagement with things at that low level is really important to you. Is that what it is that drew you into live coding work?
So I think for many, it's also a response to the problems of creating graphical user interfaces or instruments, because when you create an interface or a controller of some sort, it could be a physical controller, you're really defining the thing, and you're creating almost like a composition in the form of a device or a screen-based gadget of some sort, widget. But with live coding, suddenly you're just there and you're able to do everything in an improvisational context, and it creates an interesting challenge, I think, to be able to define your instrument as you're playing it in real time in front of audience, or in your studio alone. It doesn't have to be in front of audience, but as you might know, creating graphical user interfaces, if you are working on such software, you might spend 80% of the time doing the interface and 20% of the time doing the code,
Sure.
Because there's so much attention to the layout and the functionality, deciding what to expose to the user and what to hide and so on. But in live coding, there's none of that. There's just the language, and there's nothing that shouts at you, press me, here's a slider, move me. It's all in the code. So that's what I think is exciting about live coding. There's the language, like a human language. There's the language that kind of we're able to think in. And of course, in a way, you could say that certain functions in the language, if you speak that language, they are like sliders or buttons or knobs, But I think you're quite free when you live code, and that's what I like about it.
Well, it's interesting to me, though. The thing I find particularly interesting with live coding, first of all, because of the nature of things, live coding tools are almost all textual, right? Mm-hmm. And it sort of, to me, looks and acts very different than any other musical discipline, because almost every other musical discipline, even using software like Cubase or Ableton Live or something, you're still using a mouse to slide a slider, or you're turning knob, whether virtual or real, you're turning knobs to accomplish something. Where live coding almost seems like it's more a version of poetry than it is music, because you're describing things instead of touching things.
Yeah, that's a beautiful kind of way of looking at it. Yeah, I agree with you.
So the thing is, though, you studied music. How did you move from touching musical instruments to basically, talking to a computer about it?
So I guess, we have a predecessing kind of situation here where the composer would sit down and write onto staff notation, and then someone would perform it. I guess that's what we do with live coding. We sit down, right, and we're writing the score in the form of code, and then we have an interpreter. The live coding languages, they always have an interpreter that interprets the code and spits out some sound and visuals, maybe. So yeah, it's kind of real-time composition, really. We've had some interesting discussions in the live coding community about to what extent live coding is embodied activity, as maybe guitar playing or some such. But it's a very unique way of performing music, and quite exciting, I think.
Well, I'm especially curious then, like in that Ars Electronica piece that you did, your interface with other musicians and how that works. You mentioned that, like, when you travel, a lot of times if you come into a city, you look for an improviser that is game for working with you on these projects. What are the things that, for you, first of all, make a great collaborator in that kind of environment? But also, what are the things that you do to enable collaboration? Because, again, one of the things I know about live coders is if you want to make all the sound, you can make all the sound, right? And so you have to have a certain amount of discipline. And if you're on stage with another person, that level of discipline becomes even greater, because you have to leave the opportunity for them to be involved as well. How do you do that? What are the things, what makes a good collaborator, and what do you do to help the collaborator?
I guess any experienced improviser would say the same thing, that listening is the most important part of improvisation. So you're there to listen to what's happening on the stage, and then you fill in the gaps, if you need to, with your performance, with your playing. So I quite like to kind of have that dialogue with people when we improvise. To kind of, it's kind of a call and response sometimes. Obviously, with my drone live coding environment, I'm not very spontaneous in changing things, but things move on a different time scale. Mm-hmm. And I'm able to respond to people, and they respond to what I'm doing, and through maybe over 30, 40 minutes, we're able to kind of have a conversation through sound that is kind of interesting and beautiful. And what I like about playing with different people in different places is just to see how, because I know my instrument very well, but it's so interesting to play with different people, because everyone, to see the kind of personality of that performer come through their instrument in the context of my system. I think it's just wonderful, really, and it's a great way of kind of experiencing other musicians and other places to improvise with people from local people. I really enjoy that. And here at Sussex, I collaborate with some colleagues, Chris Kiefer and Alice Eldridge and Thanos Polymeneos Leontiris. And they've got feedback instruments, cellos and double bass, that they have built a speaker in at the back of it. And there's a kind of a feedback circuitry of sound going through the instrument. I send my drones to these instruments as well, which makes them lose control over their own instrument, and that's quite a beautiful process to kind of see them wrestle with their cello when a loud drone from my threnoscope kind of moves through their instrument.
Right. Well, and I imagine that actually, for people who are very experienced with their instrument, that's that kind of like risky thing that is a jolt of excitement when you're performing, right?
Yeah. We perform in a band called the Brain Dead Ensemble. I think for them, kind of experienced musicians, and for them it's exciting. It's exciting to have something that you're not in control of fully. It's like sailing a boat or riding a wild horse or something.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. It's fun.
I want to talk a little bit about your book project. The name of the book again is
Sonic Writing.
Sonic Writing, yes, of course. In the acknowledgments, you talk about this being part of a UK Arts and Humanities Research Council Fellowship. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because it sounds like it was a real amazing opportunity for you to work on this project.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning them. That was a fantastic grant I got from them, and it allowed me to focus on writing this book, but also organizing certain events that led to the research of these certain parts of the book. So I, together with IRCAM in Paris and STIME in Amsterdam, I organized some symposia. I also did visiting residencies at CENMAT in Berkeley, and CMC, the Center for Computer Music in Columbia University. And through these kind of residencies, meeting local people and interviewing people, I was able to gain such a broad, holistic picture of the field that I think I couldn't have written this book really without that time and opportunity to travel the world and do this research, really.
Right, that's amazing, and it seems like an incredible opportunity. It also seems, unfortunately, that some of those grants are starting to not be as available as they once were. For whatever economic reason, that some of these things are becoming less available, and it's too bad, because, as you said, it's not the affordance of money as much as it affords time. Doing a well-researched book is just a time sink, I think. How long were you working on the book prior to its being published?
Yeah, I guess 2.5 years or something.
Wow.
So it took me maybe 9 months to write it, but the kind of research that led to the book, yeah, I spent 2.5 years collaborating with people, doing background research, organizing symposia and concerts, and a conference here at Sussex, the Live Interfaces conference we had in 2016. So a lot of these things, I don't know if you've organized a conference, you think it's going to take a couple of weeks, but then you end up sitting in front of your email client for 4 months.
It's overwhelming. Absolutely.
Yeah. True. Yeah. So but it's rewarding as well, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm not complaining, but I don't think I'm going to organize anything anytime soon, you know.
So what is up next for you now that the book's been published? Have you already started work on your next book, or are you going to just settle down and perform for a while? What's next up for you?
I am working on another book, but the thing that is the main kind of focus at the moment is a project that I'm working on with colleagues in Durham University, Goldsmiths College, and here at Sussex. And it's called the Mimic Project. And it's a project where we take machine learning libraries and we give them into the hands of kind of creative coders, novice coders, basically musicians who want to work with machine learning technologies. So we have recently launched the project. It's called mimicproject.com. Where you can see all kinds of kind of examples and libraries that we are developing. But this summer we're working on an artist's workshop where we will invite people to come here to Brighton and work with us in designing their own live coding programming languages for machine learning. So at the moment we're working on a system where people can kind of come up with small constraint live coding languages that translate into JavaScript, and we have created a kind of a sound engine in JavaScript, basically written in C++, but transpiled up to JavaScript. And people are then able to kind of live code smaller or create their own little languages interfacing with this kind of sound engine and with these machine learning libraries.
I love it. That sounds great. I've always been a fan of the concept of little languages or domain-specific languages as being a way to really be focused on what the end result is. I think that sounds amazing.
Yeah. And we're kind of thinking about the language itself. It's not even just a language. It's almost like the language becomes an instrument, you know. So you could create a bespoke language for rhythm generation, another language for bass lines, you know, or yet another language just to spew out some visuals, you know. So we're really thinking about the language as something super simple, super limited. But if you have few of them, you then can create a band of languages, you know.
Right, sure. Well, Thor, our time is up. Before I let you go, though, for people who are interested in learning more about your work, where's the best place for them to check?
Yeah, I guess you can just type my name into Google and you find all kinds of things. My kind of work website, and then there is sonicwriting.org, which is my kind of recent research and the research behind the book. I then have a website called ixieaudio.net, and that's a website I run with a friend of mine, Enrique Hurtado.
Is that where people would be able to find the Theranoscope and some of these other software packages?
Yeah, they can find a lot of it on Ixie Audio.
Okay.
So type that into a search engine. The Theranoscope itself is something that I haven't released yet. I want to finish it this summer, and my plan is to release it when I've kind of fixed up some minor issues.
Well, that sounds like that gives us all something to look forward to, and it sounds very exciting. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule. This is a fascinating talk, and it's got my head spinning about thinking about philosophy or music being applied philosophy. I mean, that's just a thought experiment that's going to keep me keep me cooking for a while. But I want to thank you for your time and for having this chat for us.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. It's been great fun talking with you.
All right.
Thanks.
Well, with that, I'm going to let you go. Have a good one. Bye now.
Thanks. Bye-bye.